Welcome to the 5-Minute PM Episode 7, where we break down everything project management into 5-minute segments. Risk mitigation is essential in project management, but often we only think of the basics, assigning a backup resource or padding the schedule. However, there are many underutilized strategies that can greatly reduce the likelihood and impact of risks. Today, we're going to dive into some lesser-known tips and tricks for mitigating risks that can give your projects a competitive edge. The basics of risk mitigation. Before we jump into the advanced tips, let's quickly touch on the fundamentals of risk mitigation. In project management, risk mitigation involves developing strategies to reduce the likelihood of a risk occurring or minimizing the impact if it does. There are 4 primary risk response strategies: avoid, transfer, mitigate, and accept. Most project managers are familiar with these responses. For example, avoidance, changing the project plan to eliminate the risk; transfer, shifting the risk to a third party, like insurance or outsourcing; mitigation, taking steps to reduce the probability or impact of the risk; acceptance, recognizing the risk and preparing for it without proactive intervention. While these strategies are important, we'll now explore some underutilized approaches to take your risk mitigation efforts to the next level. Tip 1. Pre-mortems. Planning for failure. We've all heard of postmortems, where teams analyze what went wrong after a project is completed. But have you heard of pre-mortems? A pre-mortem is a technique where you assume the project has failed before it even starts, and you work backward to figure out what went wrong. This approach gives teams the freedom to discuss potential pitfalls without feeling constrained by optimism bias or groupthink. In practice, gather your team early in the project and ask everyone to imagine that the project has been a complete disaster. Have each team member describe what went wrong. By proactively discussing failure scenarios, you uncover risks that might otherwise be missed, allowing you to implement mitigation strategies before problems arise. Tip 2. Incremental deliverables to reduce risk. One often overlooked strategy for risk mitigation is to break down deliverables into smaller incremental pieces. This allows you to mitigate scope creep, catch potential issues earlier, and reduce the overall risk of a large deliverable going off track. When you break your project into smaller increments, you get more frequent feedback and opportunities to course correct. For example, in software projects, using the Agile methodology with regular sprints allows teams to address risks as they appear, rather than waiting until the end of a lengthy waterfall process. By delivering smaller increments of value, you reduce the risk of major rework later on. This approach is particularly useful for highly complex projects where requirements or environments are subject to change. Tip 3. Scenario planning for external risks. Scenario planning is another underutilized tool in risk mitigation. Often, we focus on internal risks that are within our control, but external risks like market fluctuations, regulatory changes, or supplier issues can have just as much, if not more, impact on project success. Scenario planning involves imagining a range of future environments in which your project might operate. For instance, how would your project be affected if the cost of raw materials doubled? What if new regulations made your current processes obsolete? By thinking through these scenarios, you can build contingency plans to mitigate external risks more effectively. This is particularly useful for projects with long timelines or those operating in volatile industries. Companies that regularly engage in scenario planning have a competitive advantage because they can adapt more quickly when external risks materialize. Tip 4. Use of contingency reserves for known unknowns. Many project managers include contingency reserves in their project budgets, but often these reserves are not tied to specific risks. A more strategic approach is to link your contingency reserve directly to the identified risks, especially those categorized as known unknowns, risks you're aware of but can't fully predict. For example, if you know there's a 20% chance of a critical vendor delay, allocate part of your contingency specifically for that risk. This way, the contingency is used proactively rather than being a generic buffer, and it encourages a disciplined approach to budgeting for risk. By tracking how contingency reserves are allocated and used throughout the project, you can better understand your risk exposure and adjust your mitigation strategies accordingly. Tip 5. Leveraging risk owners. Another powerful but underutilized strategy is to assign risk owners for every identified risk. A risk owner is a person responsible for monitoring the risk and implementing the mitigation strategy if the risk materializes. Assigning risk ownership ensures accountability and prevents risks from falling through the cracks. Risk owners should regularly review the status of their risks, especially as project conditions change. By maintaining clear ownership and regularly tracking these risks, you create a culture of proactive risk management rather than reactive firefighting. Best practices suggest that the risk owner should be someone with the authority to implement mitigation strategies directly, ensuring fast responses to emerging issues. Risk mitigation in project management goes beyond simply identifying and preparing for potential problems. By using these lesser-known strategies like pre-mortems, incremental deliverables, scenario planning, strategic contingency reserves, and assigning risk owners, you can significantly improve your ability to mitigate risks before they derail your project. Risk mitigation is an ongoing process. Make sure to revisit your risk mitigation plans regularly as your project evolves, and you'll find yourself better prepared for whatever comes your way. Thank you for listening to the 5-Minute PM. Remember to get more project management tips and tricks. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to this channel.